perfecto. Pues yo le dije a mi mamá que me hiciera la tarea, por eso pasé la materia contigo.
Hola, buenos días. Buenos días a todas, a todos. Les damos la bienvenida a esta tercera y última sesión del curso, ¿no? Donde vamos a continuar con las discusiones que se han venido presentando en torno a la teoría moderna del dinero, ¿no? Y entonces le doy la palabra al doctor Randall Gray.
Okay, so there were two readings today. They're not closely linked together. So I'm going to do the first one, value theory, and then we can take a break and then talk a bit about the second one. Sorry, the reverse of the way they're listed here. Value first, and then the financing capital development using Minsky's work. All right, from the very beginning, MMT has been known for claiming taxes drive money. Already talked about that 2 days ago. And from inception, obligations create a demand for the currency. But that leaves open the value of money. It just says people will accept it. It doesn't say what it's going to be worth. So taxes do not determine the value of money. Just make sure it has some value. So the question was, what determines its value? And from the beginning, from January of 1996, when Warren first came online, he said, well, it depends on what you have to do to get a hold of it. So that sounds like it's labor effort. And of course, for economists, not for Warren, it sounds like the labor theory of value. In simple models, it's been shown by MMT advocates, including me in my 1998 book, that the government can control wages with a job guarantee. And the other day, I talked about the job guarantee. I only talked about the job guarantee setting a floor. But if the government stands ready to buy and sell labor like it does corn, it can set the price of corn. Okay, so in agricultural price support programs, it's not just that you set the floor, you also set the ceiling price. Government could try to do that with labor too. So possibly you can do that. And it's always been claimed by some MMT people that the government can control other prices by setting the price that it pays. And the reason is because the government is usually by far the biggest purchaser in an economy of a wide range of things. Okay, so in simple models, possibly, as the monopoly supplier of money in the form of currency, it's the only currency supplier, the government can name its price. I never quite believed it because these simple models are never of capitalist economies. They are of hypothetical economies. And so they aren't really telling us whether within a capitalist system, the government really would be able to set the price. Would that be consistent with a capitalist system? And I had my doubts about that. So what we need to do is dig deeper into the nature of capitalism and see if those arguments are consistent with the way capitalism works. And we need to get into the relation between prices and value and what determines each of those, okay? So that's what I try to do in this paper. It's a synthesis of various strands of heterodox economics, including Marxism, post-Keynesianism. I already went through the history of money so far as we know it, 10,000 years of written records of the development of money in Mesopotamia. So we know money long predates capitalism. Okay, so it already was around. And I believe it also predates markets. So money comes before capitalism, it even comes before markets. The historical record shows there's a co-evolution of writing with money over the past 10,000 years. The modern money period was defined by Keynes as the past 4,000 years. David Graeber's book is Debt the Past 5,000 Years, pushing it back a bit further. So the point is, money is very much older than capitalism. Capitalism is relatively recent. Okay, so that's the point. Money originated as a unit of account in which debts are denominated. I think that that is perfectly consistent with everything we know about the historical record. And it's the starting point for our logical analysis. None of that requires markets and almost certainly predates them. David Levine, who was my colleague at University of Denver, wrote a paper in the 80s in which he argued that specialization that's required for markets would be far too risky without prices and money. So remember, the barter story starts with specialization. You've already got it. You've got Robinson Crusoe and Friday specializing and then trying to barter. So that's the story. And you argue this is illogical. Nobody's going to specialize in a non-monetary economy. It's too risky. What if nobody wants the fish? Okay, and you need other stuff. You're not going to specialize until there already is a market economy with money. It makes no sense to argue that money comes out of a pre-specialized production system. So the specialization required for markets would be far too risky without prices and money. Markets likely developed in long-distance trade, not locally, and it would be in a money of account with negotiated prices. This is consistent with Karl Polanyi, if you've read his work on the origination of markets and prices. Prices always had to be negotiated. Polanyi said that market exchange was very much similar to war. Okay, it's not this higgling and haggling, this nice Adam Smith story. No, it's more like war. You negotiate the prices. Okay, so you need leadership, you need authorities before trade can even occur. And then debts would be settled in commodities at the official prices. And Michael Hudson has also written about this for the case of Mesopotamia. All the prices are posted on the temple columns. No trade can occur at any other price. It must be at the temple's price. So this completely changes the logic. We start with social debts. Okay, Vergeld probably is where social debts came from. And then we get debts denominated in a money of account. Then we get prices in a money of account. Then much later, we get transferable nominal debts, what Keynes called money things, what I call money records. And then finally, we start using those things in markets. Okay, so complete reversal of the orthodox story. You have barter-based markets first. Okay. All right, capitalism. What is it? So the analysis I'm making here in this paper is limited to a capitalist system. What is a capitalist system? It's following Marx, Veblen, and Keynes, the three giants of the three main heterodox schools of thought: Marxism, Keynesianism, and institutional. It's a monetary production economy where production begins and ends with money. So it's MCM prime. That's using Marx. Keynes set out to write his general theory as a monetary theory of production. It's very clear from the drafts of the general theory. He was somehow convinced not to do it that way. So the general theory drops all of that. It's still there, but it's in the background. But it was explicit in his drafts that that's what he was trying to do. Veblen called it theory of business enterprise. Okay, it's more updated than Marx because capitalism had changed, but it's still a monetary theory of production. So that's where we begin. Where did this system come from? Well, economists used to teach, and I admit I did too, an incorrect story. the one that Heilbronn and Thoreau tell in their nice little book that I always use for freshmen, that it came out of Northern Europe. Well, that is false. We know that that is not where capitalism came from. It came from the New World. Capitalism was invented in Americas on the slave plantations. That's where capitalism actually came from. And so this is a revised view of the beginnings of capitalism in the slave plantations. Not only were all the modern monetary instruments developed on the slave plantations, but the management and control of the production process was invented on the slave plantations. So that's where it comes from. Obviously, that's even more recent than what economists used to say. Okay, so it's not until slavery in the Americas. So it's less than 400 years old. It's obviously money, states, and markets pre-existed capitalism. Okay, they existed long before 400 years ago. It's not a market economy. It's not based on free labor. It's based on commodification of labor. It doesn't matter whether it's free or unfree. Okay, this is a point Graeber makes. Graeber says there was no such thing as free labor before the 19th century. Even if we're talking about England, France, colonial America, there was no such thing as free labor. So it doesn't need to be free labor. And so that's why capitalism is perfectly consistent with slavery. There's no capitalism without a state. This is pretty obvious. Slavery depended extraordinarily on the state to protect the ships, to protect the cargo, not because they worried about the lives of slaves. They worried about the investment in their bodies. You needed the state to protect them. You know, modern ships, fast ships were developed because too many slaves died. And modern warfare developed to protect the ships and protect the monopoly trade routes and so on. So anyway, there's no capitalism without a state. The state has both state money and private credit money. And as I talked a little bit last time, and it's in my credit and state theories of money paper, what happened was the state money and the private money got connected into a single payments giro. So previous to the integration of those two in the UK, it occurred in the UK, the private money system and the state money system were separate. The brilliance of the creation of the Bank of England brought them together, created the modern monetary system. So it has both of these, and in both cases, money is endogenous. It's created internally within either the private monetary system or the state monetary system. So it's an endogenous money. The state and private credit monies evolved together in a mutually reinforcing dynamic to produce modern capitalism. Capitalism changes the logic of production from satisfying economic needs to accumulating capital in money form. It's based on exploitation. So Marx, of course, focused on labor, but it exploits everything. It exploits land, water, air, animals, families, and the other, I mean, in the case of the development of capitalism in America, it's Africa that's being exploited. Africa had to birth and raise children that then got kidnapped. And also Africa trained them. The enslavers purposely kidnapped highly skilled African labor to come over and teach the colonists how to do things. So the big structures in colonial America were built by slaves, not by the colonists. They didn't have the skills. So anyway, they were exploiting Africa. All right. So value and effort. Taxes drive money, but what determines its value? Value is commonly attributed to labor effort. Warren Moser gives the example. He wanted his kids to wash the car. And he said, I will pay you each two of my business cards if you'll wash the car. And they say, why would we want your business cards? And he would say, well, because you don't get television or dinner if you don't wash the car. So that created a demand for his business cards. The labor effort determines what they're worth. Graeber said, mercantilists located wealth in precious metals. Physiocrats argued it's derived from agriculture. But Adam Smith drew on the moral tradition that argued instead that intrinsic value had to be based in the costs of production, which made labor the main source of value. So in Smith, value is separated from price, but the invisible hand divided by divine providence, there's a big debate what he meant by invisible hand. Most likely it's God, it's not the market. But anyway, divided by providence would push market prices toward the natural price, which in turn meant that people would be justly rewarded for their labors. So they're separate, but they become equal because the invisible hand makes sure that the price is the natural price that rewards the labor. So you can map the labor value to the price. Marx took that up, arguing that the capitalist wage system turns human should have put his name. This is Graeber, a quote from Graeber. Human creativity itself into an abstraction that can be bought or sold, necessarily involving alienation, exploitation, and the destruction of what makes life meaningful or worthwhile. So what is value? Outside economics, value is closely associated to normative concepts. And Smith, of course, was not an economist. He was a moral philosopher. And the early economics was concerned with what is fair. Okay. So that's what they meant by value, just or fair price. In classical economics, it became the labor theory of value, but I know that you all study Marx and you know that there are many different labor theories of value, some of them completely incoherent. And Smith and each individual had many, not realizing that they were different. Okay, so it's some form of labor theory of value. Neoclassical economics rejects the normative approach, substitutes individualistic subjective utility theory of value. So they deny that there could be any objective measure of value. It's all individually determined. And then relative prices clear the markets. So prices really don't reflect any objective value. They reflect relative scarcity. And if something is not relatively scarce, it has no price. Money determines nominal price, and it's very hard to tell, but it seems like there's really no difference between price and value because the price is telling us how scarce it is, and that's what gives it value. Okay, but they don't really talk about value. They talk about utility and price. What about in heterodoxy? Most heterodox economists don't want to discuss it. They reject both the labor theory of value and the utility theory of value, and they seem to just go straight to price. Marxists adopt labor theory of value. Institutionalists do talk about value theory, but theirs is the instrumental value theory, sort of a pragmatic theory of value. The fundamentalist Keynesians, this is Minsky, Davidson, Kriegel. Fundamentalist means you focus on chapter 17. Okay, and I don't exactly know why they were called fundamentalists, but that sort of got adopted. So they are the ones that focus on chapter 17, where what Keynes was trying to do, he didn't call it this, but Townsend who was very close to Keynes in 1937, wrote an interpretation of Keynes's liquidity preference theory and said it is a theory of value. It's a theory of how we value assets. Okay, so that's what liquidity preference gives us. So anyway, that is the liquidity preference theory of value. And then Sraffians adopt the standard commodity. Many post-Keynesians adopt a markup approach to pricing. So my colleague at UMKC was one of the foremost markup theorists, Fred Lee. And some adopt a class conflict approach to price and distribution. Many post-Keynesians adopt that, but without a labor theory of value. So the question is value theory necessary? Because it seems like many heterodox economists get by without it and don't even want to talk about it. So I'll try to make an argument following others that it really is necessary to have a theory of value. Heilbronner said, the general problematic of value as I see it is the effort to tie the surface phenomenon of economic life to some inner structure or order. It necessarily looks beyond appearances for essences. Economics becomes an inquiry into the systemic properties, the structural attributes, the tendencies. So I would take that, those three words there, or terms, as his argument for having a theory of value. And sometimes even the telos of the provisioning process, which means the end or the purpose. What's the end or purpose of the provisioning process? Graeber put it this way: the goal is to understand the workings of any system of exchange as part of a larger systems of meaning, containing conceptions of what the cosmos is ultimately about, which sounds very similar to Heilbronner, and what is worth pursuing in it. Heilbronner again, value theory is therefore indispensable for understanding how the capitalist system, largely guided by price stimuli, tends towards some kind of determinate outcome. And then I like low the best. Gets right to the point. Suppose that a universal amnesia were to wipe out the knowledge of all present prices. Would there be a rule for reestablishing them? Okay, so is price determination systematic? Can we understand what determined the prices? Or are they just sort of randomly set? So we wake up tomorrow, can we reproduce the prices? So our theory of value informs our beliefs about how the deep structure of the capitalist economic system creates a system of prices. Okay, so it's an alternative to the Walrasian auctioneer in a general equilibrium model. The labor theory of value from Ricardo. We have the view that a commodity's value is determined by the labor required for production. The problem is that he ignores capital. So he's only looking at the labor that's actually involved in the production, not the dead labor in the capital. So Marx, of course, criticizes him heavily. He says, labor power produces surplus value and exploitation appropriates it. Keynes, when he sets out, there are 3 chapters where he sets out the basic units and assumptions he's going to use in his theory of effective demand, 4, 5, and 6. And in there, he says labor is the only factor of production, makes it very clear. The general theory adopts only 2 fundamental units of quantity, quantities of money value and quantities of employment, and 2 measuring units, the wage unit and the quantity of hours. That sounds an awful lot like Marx. This is the only way to get around problems of measuring the volume of heterogeneous output and the general level of prices. Why is it that Marx and Keynes came to the same conclusion? Because it is the only way. There's no other way to value heterogeneous output, okay? So if you're going to be logically consistent, These are the only two measuring units you can use. Using ordinary labor, which again sounds an awful lot like Marx, because you have to do it this way, as our unit, and weighting an hour's employment of special labor in proportion to its remuneration to make labor time a homogeneous measure. Now, some people object, well, labor's not homogeneous either, but this is perfectly fine as logic. And in the real world, it's not that hard to do either. We even have, in the United States, we have statistics that sort of do this, official statistics. Okay. Anyway, the point is, it's much easier to make labor homogeneous by using ordinary labor than it is to make capital homogeneous. In the general theory, this is Kahn interpreting the general theory. In the general theory, the money wage is the fulcrum on which rests the whole structure of everything expressed in terms of money. So it all comes down to the money wage. All prices, incomes of every kind, and all money values. A higher level of money wages means that everything expressed in terms of money is higher in the same proportion. Okay, there was a question, I think, about this the other day. There are two Marxian approaches to the value of money. So the first is that labor hours required to produce the commodity money determines the value of money, just like any other commodity. So Marx goes through an exposition of this. Two problems with it. It's not consistent, I don't believe, with other arguments that he's making. And second, even if it was, it's completely irrelevant to the modern capitalist economy. And I would say to almost all of history. The one exception, which I talked about, was the 400-year period in which the UK did closely link the pound to gold. But that was an aberration. And you don't want to have a special theory of capitalism that requires an aberration. So I don't think that this is a legitimate approach, even if this truly was Marx, which I don't think. It would be irrelevant if that's what he believed. The second approach is that the value of money is determined at the aggregate level by socially necessary labor time. So it's not in individual commodities, it's at the aggregate level. Money is a pure measure of abstract value. It's the only pure form we can measure. Okay. Money values are not labor value, not labor values drive production decisions. Okay, capitalists don't care what the labor value is. It's MC M prime. The only thing that matters is M prime. So they only care about money, not about the labor hours. Money is the only measure of success. At the aggregate level, money value exactly measures the aggregate of labor value. So at the aggregate level, of course, we use GDP. At the aggregate level, that's an accurate reflection of the labor value that was used over the course of the year. Prices at the micro level deviate from labor values in a predictable way. Okay, there's this long debate, completely off point, about the transformation problem. You cannot transform prices to labor values. You can't. That wouldn't be capitalism. That's what Engels said. So anyway, at the micro level, they have to deviate to reward the more capital intensive processes. So this was the mistake the previous proponents of labor theory of value had made. They didn't recognize that labor values have to deviate from prices because you have to redistribute surplus value to the processes that use more capital. There's a tendency to equalize money profits on capital. I highlighted tendencies because we don't expect to ever see this to be true, but there is a tendency to equalize money profit rates. and to equalize the rate of exploitation of labor across different production processes. Okay, as long as labor and capital are free to move, then you would expect this result, that both the rate of exploitation and the rate of profit will tend to be equalized because labor and capital can move from one type of production to another type of production. Okay, this was Foley's, I can't remember what they call it in the debates, but his revision of the view to include equalization of the rate of exploitation. So implications for the value of money. The value of money is not the inverse of the aggregate price level, which is, I think, the way that most heterodox economists think about it. All we do is we take the inverse of the price level. As both Sraffa and Keynes argued and demonstrated, price indices are arbitrary. Okay, so we have the CPI, Consumer Price Index. It's arbitrary. You can look in detail at the decisions they made to come up with that index. That's true for every price index. So they are arbitrary. And the reason that they're arbitrary is because heterogeneous output cannot be added up. So we get back to that problem. If output is heterogeneous, you can't just add it up. Each change in the composition of output changes the price index. So I think this was in the 20s when Sraffa and Keynes were going through this. That's why we use only two measures of value, labor hours and money wage unit. The value of money equals the amount of labor time it can purchase at the aggregate level, not at the level of the production of individual commodities. So it's only true at the aggregate level that the value of money equals labor time. The money value of output as a whole is equal to total labor hours multiplied by the money wage unit. So that will give us the total money value of output. Just take the total number of hours used times the money wage. Again, we are weighting labor hours according to how productive the workers are. Minsky, the price of output is complexly determined and must be higher relative to wages paid to produce it to cover finance and other overhead costs. So Minsky has this same idea that we've got to redistribute profits across firms to cover what he called different business style expenses. Okay, things like the advertising, management, taxes, how financialized the firm is. All of those things go into determining how much of the total amount of profits generated have to be redistributed to those firms. The firms with higher overhead have to get more profits, gross profits, in order to cover their high overhead costs. Okay, so it's the same notion that you get in Marx. Associated with a version of capitalism in which the output is produced. He used to joke there are 57 varieties of capitalism that came from pickle jars. Heinz Pickles claimed they had 57 varieties of pickles. So this is important because if we talk about how the capitalist economies have become financialized, what we're talking about is the overhead is a lot bigger, which means that we have to generate more profits and ensure that that greater quantity of profits are going to those firms that have been financialized. Okay, Duncan Foley talks about this too. It has to increase the rate of exploitation in Marxist terms. In Minsky's terms, it has to increase the total amount of profits generated. Okay, same thing, since profits are generated by surplus value. Foley, all value is created in production and conserved in the sphere of circulation. I think that this is straight Marx. Maybe not all Marxists agree, but this was my interpretation too. However, at the individual firm level, money revenue deviates from its labor value equivalent as surplus value is redistributed, where one party gives up more value than it receives in money value added, with losers exactly matched by winners. So if you're a firm, your Coca-Cola, Minsky always used Coca-Cola as the example. And then Crown Cola was the other one. I don't know if they even exist, but the point is one is a name brand and the other is not a name brand. So you got the big name brand, you're going to be able to reap far more profits. And you have higher costs too. You have advertising. The non-brand name firms don't advertise. They can't afford it. So Coca-Cola will get a much higher profit rate. They will get more value than they have produced themselves. The value of money. Foley, the labor theory of value is the claim that the money value of the whole mass of net production of commodities expresses the expenditure of the total social labor in a commodity producing economy. So again, the whole mass at the aggregate level. A unit of money in this approach, so now we're going down to the micro level, can be thought of as a claim to a certain amount of abstract social labor expended in the economy. So that dollar you've got gives you a dollar's worth claim on the output that's been generated by the total amount of labor hours and the total amount of times the wage unit. So whatever that is, a million, you have $1 worth of that million of money value that has been created. That's the value of money. Any particular commodity can be seen as embodying a certain fraction of the total abstract social labor expended in producing commodities. It also exchanges for a certain amount of money, its price, which represents a possibly different fraction of the abstract social labor expended. So again, we have to redistribute the value that's created because we have different production processes, more capital, less labor, and because we have different overhead expenses. The value of money is then defined as the ratio of aggregate labor time to aggregate money value. So how much labor effort can be purchased with a unit of money? We get back to it's the effort, the labor effort determines money value. Note, overhead, including Minsky's business style expenses, an explosion in the fire sector, which is financialization, fire insurance, and real estate. Now we have to include Silicon Valley and AI, huge expenses. They may greatly eclipse the financial sector. So we need to include that in there. Means the price system must redistribute surplus toward firms with higher overhead, and the rate of exploitation must be higher to increase the surplus to be distributed. So what AI is going to do is greatly increase the rate of exploitation to cover all of that overhead. To be realized, unproductive spending must rise. So we have to have the spending in excess of spending on the wage bill. Okay. So in the past, the way post-Keynesians have always looked at it, following Keynes, it's either net exports or it's the government sector. You think about the Kolesky equation, right? That will provide the extra profits that are needed. Now the amount that has to be spent in excess of the wage bill in the consumption sector and the wage bill in the investment sector is going to be much greater to cover all of the Wall Street and Silicon Valley costs. Unproductive spending. I know there's a big debate. What's productive? What's unproductive? So I'm saying the fire sector and Silicon Valley, it's all unproductive spending. Okay. turning to the contribution that comes from chapter 17. So that has been interpreted, as I said, by the fundamentalist Keynesians as a theory of asset prices. Okay, and I think it's important to add this on to the labor theory of value. So what I'm saying is two theories of value. And I first started doing this in 1992, and then set it aside for a long time. Because we need a theory of asset prices. Assets don't need labor. Okay, now some assets do. Capital assets are in the production part of the economy, and those require labor. But we have financial assets too. They don't require labor. Of course, there's a tiny bit of labor involved. Somebody does work in the bank, okay? But the value of financial assets goes way beyond the labor in the financial sector, okay? So we need a theory of what determines those prices. So this is essential to Keynes's theory of effective demand. If you know Kragle's work, he wrote, the multiplier and liquidity preference are two sides of the same coin. You can't throw out liquidity preference if you have the multiplier. So it's the other side of the coin. It's his theory of investment. So it's essential to Keynes's theory of effective demand. Money's total return, which is mostly due to liquidity, is the rooster that sets the standard. These are the words Keynes uses in the general theory, chapter 17. It's the rooster that sets the standard for all other assets, and the terms on which access to external finance is available affects the level of investment. So the idea is that the return to liquid assets sets a standard that the return to capital assets has to beat, or you get no investment. Then there is no multiplier. So this is the theory of investment, and therefore the theory of effective demand. Instead of determining prices after production has taken place, that is in the sphere of circulation, money does it, again, this is Keynes, money does its job earlier. So money does its job before production. Instead of determining prices after production has taken place, money does its job earlier in the investment decision, not in the pricing of final output. So unlike mainstream theory, which sees production and then the money supply determines prices, Keynes says, no, money is in the production decision. That's where it does its job in determining prices, not once they're already produced. Investment, in turn, determines effective demand and the wage bill in the investment sector. So Keynes doesn't use the Koleski equation, but you can understand this completely. That's how you get in the simple economy, where you only have investment and consumption. All the profits come from hiring workers in the investment sector because they're going to buy consumption goods. So that generates profits for the consumption sector. So investment determines the effective demand and the wage bill in the investment sector, and therefore the aggregate profit. In the general theory, Keynes doesn't include the government or the foreign sector. So it's the simple model. So that is the surplus value in money terms, if we translate Keynes to Marx, available to be redistributed among the capital, or dead labor if we convert it to Marx. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between Keynes and Marx. Fan Hung in 1939 wrote a paper that demonstrated you can translate Keynes to Marx one-to-one. Again, money's value is linked to labor hours, not to price. Money does its work earlier, not in determining the price, in determining the effective demand. That's what he means by earlier in the process. It determines effective demand, not price. So we need both the liquidity preference and the labor theories of value to analyze a monetary production economy, that is capitalism. Okay, so why do we need two? We need the liquidity preference theory of value to tell us what investment is going to be. You don't have a theory of investment without the liquidity preference theory. And then the labor theory of value, it tells us how profits and exploitation rates are equalized while redistributing the surplus value that's been created in order to cover the higher overhead costs, including capital. Okay, I'm going to be wrapping up. Putting value back into economics. So as you know, economics started as moral philosophy. It was a normative science from the beginning. Neoclassical economics claims to be value free. There's no standard of justice outside the market itself. This is all from Graeber. When capitalist societies, within capitalist societies, the word value is normally invoked to refer to all those domains of human action that are not governed by the laws of the market. So normative things are outside the market. The market and economics that studies the market doesn't make value judgments. So we hear about family values, spiritual values, values in domains of art and political ideas, ideals. In other words, values begin precisely where economic value ends. Marx did not propose a labor theory of value mainly as a way to explain price fluctuations, but as a way of connecting economic theory with broader moral and philosophical concerns. Capitalism turns labor into a commodity, and what an employer buys is an abstraction, the laborer's capacity to work. What makes this possible is the use of a specific symbolic medium of value, money. So it's inherent in the nature of capitalism. What about in Keynes? Here I'm going to rely on Skidelsky, who has written several books that go into Keynes's ethics, Keynes's philosophy, and of course you can go to the originals, but it's easier just to use Skidelsky. Keynes does not take wants as given, but rather strives to make our wants desirable wants. He believed that to make the world ethically better was the only justifiable purpose of economic striving. Keynes saw capitalism as a necessary stage to get societies from poverty to abundance, after which its usefulness would disappear. So he makes all this clear in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. The good is objective. It's not subjective. Okay, so it's not utility theory. We know what is good, and that which is to be maximized is not happiness or pleasure, but goodness. The love of money is a neurosis to be tolerated until we achieve the abundance that would allow us to realize the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. And we should have just about achieved this right now, according to Keynes's timeline. So we are far from that. Okay, final one, summing up. We should not equate price and value. Prices serve a variety of functions, including covering costs. Minsky talks about validating investment. So if in Minsky's approach to investment, typically firms have financed at least part of the investment through external funds. So they've gone into debt. And they need pricing power in order to validate their investment, that is, to make the payments on the debt. That's what he means by validating. And so the prices serve that function. That's very important. And it also serves the function of allocating money profits across firms. Those with pricing power are going to get more money profit. Value theory allows us to better understand the underlying economic forces of the capitalist economy, which is a monetary production economy. So that's the expanded form. While profits accrue in money terms, money does not determine price. Money does its work earlier, determining where the labor effort will be directed. Okay, in both the consumption sector and the investment sector, it's going to determine where labor effort goes. Obviously, the employers are going to put labor into the profitable production processes. And later, in determining the success of production, realizing value in money terms, which is the only term that matters to capitalists. Value is determined in production, not in circulation. While money circulates output and redistributes surplus, it doesn't determine value, which is only maintained in circulation. So the sphere of circulation doesn't create value. It's like an overhead cost. Advertising and sales costs are overhead costs. Micro level competitive advantage, pricing power, and markups over cost do not affect aggregate profits or the value of money. This was a debate I used to have with Fred Lee for a long time. This actually comes straight out of Minsky. And finally, as he was writing his last book, he put this in. He finally was convinced that the pricing power at the individual level can move more profits to you, but it doesn't create any profits. Okay, which was Minsky's point. They do affect the distribution of surplus value, but they don't create any. Money, wages, and prices are not arbitrary. They gravitate to levels to equalize profit rates and the rate of exploitation, not to clear the markets. So it's opposed to the neoclassical view that the purpose of prices is to clear markets. You get the correct market clearing vector of general equilibrium prices. Instead, what they do is equalize rates of profit and rates of exploitation. I think. Oh, okay, sorry. There is one more. What does MMT contribute to the arguments here? So since 1992, when I was first working on this, and much of it was there in at least maybe a simpler, less convincing form. But now we've got MMT. From the post-Keynesian tradition that is developed, we have endogenous credit money, which I played a role in developing in the late 80s. So money is created when banks lend, most importantly to begin the production process. Banks are not intermediaries, so banks don't take in savings and lend them out. The central bank cannot control the money supply, and money is never neutral. From Knapp, Ennis, Lerner, we get state money. The state chooses the money of account, the only measure of value we see. Okay, so that was the important point of Keynes and Marx and Foley. The only measure of value we can see is the money of account value, and that money of account is a state money of account. The state money is created when the state spends or lends, that is endogenously, just like private money. The state uses the monetary system to mobilize resources. All states do that. Some do a better job than others. We used to do a good job of to help increase productive capacity. From the chartalist tradition, both state and credit money are chartal tokens of indebtedness. So money is a debt of the issuer. And then the universal law of redemption. Bank money is redeemed in loan payments, and state money is redeemed in tax payments. So the universal law applies to both kinds of money. And I think that really was it. Yes. Okay. So now we have time for questions on this, and then a break, and then I'll do the other topic.
Bueno, no sé si tienen alguna pregunta o prefieren que continuemos. ¿No? Patrick, we're going to start with the questions.
Hello, good morning. I wanted to ask a question about you mentioned in Graeber, the putting value back into economics, and that sort of, I'm really curious just to hear more. I'm not sure if you could just elaborate a little bit more, speak a bit more about that. It's just a really interesting discussion about where economic value begins as compared to other expressions of value via family values, spiritual values, political domain, etc. I'm not sure if you could just comment briefly on that.
I don't think I really can. You need to look at Graeber's writings, especially after the famous book, or go to YouTube. He gave some very nice talks, whereas he's he's very worried about capitalism and trying to change it. You know, he was the founder of Occupy Wall Street. And so I think you'll just have to get it straight from him. I just picked out the labor theory of value stuff. He has a book on value theory that I don't remember the date of it. It should be, a reference should be in the paper, where he goes beyond labor theory of value. Okay, I just wasn't paying attention to it.
Yes.
You mentioned that two-asset theory of value. Could you explain a little bit more about this theory that is present in Minsky, but I think it's not, most of the people that read Minsky doesn't understand this, including me. So could you explain, please? It's very important because once we understand this, we can understand better financialization.
Okay, so there are two kinds of assets. Capital assets require labor in their production. Financial assets don't. And this is the only case where you get two price systems. So if you think of all consumer goods, there's only one price system. Okay, they're not held as assets. So their price comes out of the production system itself. And Minsky does not explicitly embrace the labor theory of value. But just as Van Hung translated Keynes one-to-one to Marx, I think you can do the same with Minsky. And exactly why Minsky didn't want to, because I'm sure that he knew the labor theory of value. Why he didn't want to do it, I don't know the answer to that. He rarely wrote about Marx either. He did write one for the Centennial. There's one paper by Minsky on Marx, but generally he just didn't mention Marx much, so you won't find it. But I think it's consistent. So that's the price of consumer goods. But capital also has a price of production because it has to be produced. And that price is determined in the same way as consumption. So you have a flow supply price. What price will get producers to produce it? Okay, so what price will get consumption goods producers to produce consumer goods? What price will get capital goods producers to produce it. So that's the supply price of capital, okay, determined in the production sphere. And to simplify, if you're a post-Keynesian, you'd say it's cost plus markup. Okay, good enough for this argument. Then capital also has an asset price value because you're buying it as an asset. You're not buying it to consume it. And that price will be the demand price. The demand price comes out of the asset price system. Okay. And because capital has to compete with all other kinds of assets that you could hold. So you could hold financial assets. Keynes in the General Theory, chapter 17, says that anything you can hold through time has an own rate of interest, okay, which is related to the price system. And so he started with Sraffa and trying to figure out how to price commodities because they speculated in commodities. So that's where that whole thing came from. It was Keynes and Sraffa figuring out how to make money speculating. And Keynes became extremely wealthy and produced the endowment for King's College, Cambridge, by speculating in commodities and in exchange rates. So those are examples of assets you could hold. So Minsky's not talking about those, but it could be commodities too. It could be foreign exchange. So for Keynes, it was really a broad range of anything. You know, it could be used 1967 Ford Mustangs. That's an asset that could go up in value. So it can be really universally applied to anything that you can hold through time. So for Minsky, he's focused on capital assets versus financial assets. So, you know, just like in any investment class, they'll tell you you can hold either capital or financial assets, and the capital's return has to be at least equal to what you get in financial assets, or you're not going to buy capital. Because capital, in Keynes's terms, has higher wastage costs. Depreciation, you got to take care of the capital equipment. You don't have to do those things with financial assets. You just got to store them somewhere. So they have what Keynes called a carrying cost. So actually their return has to be that much higher than the financial assets because they have a higher carrying cost. So you have to find capital investments that have a return big enough to beat the alternatives, which are financial assets. And so that gives you the demand price. So it comes out of the pricing system for assets. You compare the demand price and supply price, and the demand price has to be greater than the supply price or you get no investment. And so that's where it links up to the theory of effective demand, because investment is the driver of effective demand in the general theory, because you have a multiplier. So that's what the link is. So you need two price systems in Minsky. One is for current output and one is for assets. And then you weigh the two. Okay. And that's why Kriegel said, the reason why Kriegel wrote that paper, Two Sides of the Same Coin, is because there were lots of post-Keynesians who said, you don't need the liquidity preference stuff, including endogenous money people like Basil Moore and Mark Lavoie, who argued that that was a mistake because it's based on a fixed money supply. Because they're looking at chapters 13 and 15 of the general theory, where Keynes does have a supply and demand theory. He has money supply and money demand. And as you read it, you could imagine the money supply curve is vertical with a downward sloping money demand curve. And of course, that's what became the LM curve in Hicks. That the story is that Keynes was pushed to do it that way by the Cambridge Circus, which was the young people around him who were giving him advice. They said, nobody's going to understand chapter 17. You got to do it in supply and demand. Economists can understand supply and demand. So that's the way he did it in 13 and 15. But it was a huge mistake. There were 3 times when he gave in to them and used supply and demand analysis, and every one of them was a mistake. He did it in chapter 2 too. Remember, where he says, I will accept one of the postulates, but not the other one. We're on the demand curve, but not on the supply curve. Okay, that was a big mistake. So anyway, Kriegel writes the paper saying, no, you need liquidity preference theory. And that becomes the basis of the fundamentalists who say chapter 17 is the key chapter to understanding the theory of effective demand. You have no theory of investment without chapter 17.
¿Más preguntas? So maybe you can continue.
Okay. All right. This really isn't related, but it's topics in Minsky that I didn't get to before. This was a project that I did with Mariana Mazzucato, I don't remember how many years ago, at least 10, I think. And we put together a report. I think we did this for INET. So anyway, what we were trying to do was to synthesize ideas from Keynes, Schumpeter, and Minsky. And you probably all know Mariana's big thing is the role of the state in financing early development of innovations. Okay, so we had 5 issues. The quality versus the quantity of finance, the mismatch between demand and supply of finance, at least at some stages of the innovation process. So she's particularly interested in the earliest stages because you can't get investors providing capital for the earliest stages. They want to see that you've had some kind of results first. The US government used to provide this. And of course, she's in the UK. I don't know anything about the UK, so I won't comment on it. But she complains that the UK government isn't doing it. And it's obviously true in the United States. The federal government, really since the moon shot, we made it to the moon. Okay, and that's pretty much it. We don't directly fund enough of the early stuff. Okay, 3rd issue, public versus private finance. Okay, maybe we have plenty of private finance, but it comes at the wrong stage. We don't have enough public finance. And how to promote finance for innovation and employment. Okay, innovation is the key to long-run growth. It has to be financed. So finance is central to the innovation process. And if you've read Schumpeter, you know that his theory of economic development is all about innovation. And his argument is that the innovator has to use external funds because they're not producing yet. The innovator gets external funds, becomes a producer, then they just become capitalists. Okay, only entrepreneurs innovate. And the entrepreneur doesn't have an ongoing business yet, so they can't get, so they can't use their own funds. Capitalists can use their own funds. They use internal finance, but entrepreneurs have to use external finance. And so the banker is the F4 of capitalism. The banker has to be supplying the funds for the innovation process that allows capitalism to progress and grow and innovate. Okay, yet in recent decades, finance has retreated from serving the real economy. The financial sector serves itself. So the financial sector is lending to each other. Okay, and there's many ways to measure this. and in many ways to talk about it. So what it is doing is laying debt on top of debt on top of debt on top of debt. So maybe at the very bottom, there was some finance of productive effort. So I could take housing, for example. So you build a house, you sell it, a homeowner buys it by taking out a mortgage. So there's a mortgage there. Okay, and you got a house built. So that's direct finance, and there was production that occurred. But then what finance does is they package all the mortgages into securities and they sell those. Okay, the owners of securities will get paid if the homeowner makes the mortgage payments, but there's an intermediary there. They're actually, if you look at the securitization process, there's going to be like 25 hands in the pie to take part of the mortgage payment. Okay. But then what they do is they take those securities and they tranche them. So they will get the really safe part down to the really risky part and make new securities. So that's called re-securitization. And then they do re, and then re. Okay. So you could have, say the mortgage is $100,000. Maybe there's $500,000 leveraging that homeowner. Okay. $500,000 of debt and one homeowner that is servicing it. Okay. And when they go down, got $500,000 of bad assets out there. So, and this is repeated across everything in the financial sector. That's what they've been doing since the early 80s. So debt on debt on debt on debt. So that's serving itself. It's creating financial assets that are building on maybe debt that was related to something real. Okay, maybe not. You can create debt that is sort of a virtual reality that will depend on what happens in the mortgage market, where there was no link whatsoever. You're just betting the mortgage market will go bad. Okay, so then you can financialize that too. All right, so the companies in the real economy have become financialized. So private equity is going in and taking over the firms, and then Michael Milken started and went to prison for it. Now they're all doing it, perfectly legal. All right, the project from Keynes, we take the central insight of the theory of effective demand. Firms hire the resources. This is the one sentence summary of the general theory. This is what I always tell the students. If you can remember this, at least you know what the general theory is all about. Firms hire the resources they think they will need to produce what they think they can sell. Okay, that was a revolution of thought. Mainstream economics, they don't have this. Okay, so they hire the resources they think they will need to produce what they think they can sell. So employment is not determined in the labor markets, but rather by the level of sales expected. That's why Keynes should not have written chapter 2. He didn't get to the theory of effective demand until chapter 3. That's where you find out it has nothing to do with the labor market at all. Employment is determined by effective demand, not by the labor market. Third, rejection of loanable funds theory. So savings doesn't finance investment. And then the fundamental faults of capitalism for Keynes, these were unemployment and inequality. There's nothing to move the system to full employment, and capitalism creates too much inequality. He argues some inequality is good to reward effort, but capitalism produces too much. And then the investment theory of the cycle. Okay. The problem is it led to the simplistic bastard Keynesian driving the steering wheel, fine-tuning the economy, because it ignored the financial sector and the role played by the financial sector in the economy. Okay, Schumpeter, we borrow 2 insights: the link between the innovation process and the dynamics of the capitalist economy, and the argument that I made. Innovation needs finance. It has to be financed before it can generate revenues because it's a new process. For Schumpeter, innovation doesn't necessarily mean a scientific technological process. It could just be a new way of organizing production. That's most obvious in the case of startups. A modification is needed for the case of large, complex, well-capitalized firms that can use internal finance that they also can usually issue their own commercial paper debt. They don't need to go to financial institutions. So things have changed a bit since the Schumpeter's time. But avoid an infinite regress, neo-Schumpeterians and new institutionalists. This was sort of a dig at some of the Nobel Prize winners in institutional economics. If you read real carefully, they're all loanable funds theorists. We once had a conference bringing together the institutionalists, those kinds of institutionalists, and MMT people. And it all came down to an infinite regress. I would ask them, well, where does the money come from to pay the wage bill? Well, the firms sell output. Okay. How do the workers, how do people get the income to buy the output? Well, from the wages. You know, you don't need banks. It was an infinite regress argument. It was bizarre. They're smart people. They won Nobel Prizes, but they could not see this, that there was a problem in their argument. Anyway, and so then entrepreneurial state, which is Mariana. Okay, from Minsky, the forces of the capitalist system are not stabilizing. Adding finance, dynamics becomes worse. This was Minsky's earliest work in the 1950s, where he started with Samuelson's linear accelerator model. If you remember what it is. So the multiplier comes from Keynes, but if you make investment a function of expected future income, that's an accelerator, and the system becomes nonlinear. And the problem for the Keynesians was it's explosive. Okay, so you sort of get the Herod knife edge result that became growth theory. And so you know that capitalism is unstable, but it's not explosive like linear accelerators, so you need a way to constrain it. And what Minsky's 1950s articles did was to say the system is explosive, but institutions constrain it. Okay, so that was his work. So it's a complex, nonlinear system, and you need to put ceilings and floors on the system because otherwise it explodes up or it explodes down. Minsky broadened Schumpeter's view, not simply finance for innovation, because investment is typically externally financed. So Schumpeter was focused too much on the innovator and making this big difference between entrepreneurs and capitalists. Capitalists too need external finance. We can go further. All production has to be financed. So it's MCM prime. You have to start with money. So it's not even just investment. It's all production has to be financed. The money has to come from somewhere. Finance itself is subject to innovation. So this was Minsky's extension of his professor's work. Financial firms themselves also innovate. And finally, stability is destabilizing, mainly due to innovations in finance that are encouraged by the appearance of stability. So stability is destabilizing. Early contributions. This comes from his 1957 article. Innovation is endogenous. Here we're talking about the financial institutions. It responds to profit opportunity, and I talked about how a lot of the innovations are made to get around regulations. So we come out of World War II with heavy regulations on the financial system. So they're innovating to try to get around. When one of those innovations, stretches liquidity too far and you get a crisis, the government intervenes and it validates the innovation. Okay, so if something was too risky, the government comes in and saves it, and now everyone knows they can use it because the government is going to save you. So it validates the innovations. Okay, multiplier accelerator, ceilings and floors, I was talking about, means the time path can be steady growth, cycles, booms, long depressions. It depends on the institutions that constrain it. So when he's writing in the 50s, he says, right now, everything is pretty stable. Why? Because we have institutions that constrain it. He began worrying about it. We have our first crisis in the US in 1966. So we went for 20 years with no financial crises, and then we get one in 66, and then they start coming more frequently and more severe. And in 82, he published a collection of his writings that was called Can It Happen Again? And his answer was no. By 1989, he's thinking, yes, it can. Okay, the institutions, either they had gone away or deteriorated, or the innovations just meant the institutions didn't work anymore. Okay, so institutions of the early post-war promoted stability, but it's destabilizing, and the institutions we have now don't work. Minsky's proposals, the institutions for modern capitalism. Capitalism is dynamic and comes in many forms. The 1930s reforms are not appropriate for money manager capitalism. Beginning in 89, he started calling this stage we're in money manager capitalism. And he had 4 or 5 different stages of capitalism that he wrote about, going back to the late 19th century when we had the commercial capitalism, where commercial banks were the most important. Then we had the rise of finance capitalism. Same thing that Hilferding is talking about, where the investment banks are dominant. And then we had the crash, and then we had managerial welfare state capitalism, which was the New Deal with a big government and a bigger role for the Fed to play. And then finally, we have money manager capitalism. Other people call it financialized capitalism, which they're talking about the same thing. The difference is Minsky's emphasizing that the financial system is in charge by money managers. That was the new thing. So it's not a big investment bank. It's professional money managers, and they're all competing with each other to get the highest average. If you don't beat everyone else, you lose all of your customers. Okay, so the 1930s reforms don't work anymore. Free market ideology is dangerous. New policies are needed to reduce insecurity, promote stability, and encourage democracy. So Minsky wasn't just worried about financial stability. He always was worried about insecurity and democracy and bigness. He was always against bigness, big firms, big banks. He wanted to promote medium-sized ones because he didn't think the big ones are consistent with democracy. So all those things. We have to reform the financial system before we can reform the capitalist system. He would always say that capitalism is a financial system. So to reform capitalism, you have to reform finance. A revised view of finance. The conventional view is that what the financial sector does is it intermediates between savers and investors. We have 2 different proofs that it's efficient, right? Modigliani-Miller theorem says it doesn't make any difference how you finance, whether you use your own funds, borrowed funds, makes no difference. And then the efficient markets hypothesis is that the financial markets themselves are efficient. You can't improve. The reality, as Keynes argued, savings doesn't finance anything, investment creates saving. Okay, so the investment has to come first. The injections have to come before leakages. Leakages can't finance injections. It has to be the other way around. Or the way that I would put it, the finance is created simultaneously with the spending. It's a system of credits and debits. Okay, so there's always going to be entries onto balance sheets. That's how spending takes place. Financialization, which is what we have, is not finance. Okay, it's layering or leveraging debt on debt. Securitized mortgages, these are other examples. Life settlements, where they speculate on how soon you will die. Private pension plans, healthcare reform are all examples of financialization. They aren't providing finance. Private equity layers debt on takeover targets, strips them bare, leaves a failing carcass of a firm. Why do we allow all this? Because there's this myth that finance is a scarce resource. Why does Congress continually expand what they allow? Because the argument is always made that we need more finance. Okay, it's a myth. Finance is not a scarce resource. So Wall Street runs the show. The tail that wags the dog. And you can see that clearly. Now, I'm going to have to revise all this because now it's Silicon Valley. It's AI. It completely runs the show in Congress. Everyone caters to AI now. So everything Congress does is going to be to please them. When Minsky came to the Levy Institute in 1990, he started this project. It became the foundation of our annual Minsky conference. He called it Reconstituting Finance to Promote the Capital Development of the Economy. So you can see what he wanted to do. We need to constrain finance, and we need to make it promote capital development. When Minsky says capital development, he doesn't necessarily mean physical capital. Okay, it doesn't mean private capital. He defined capital development very broadly. It would include educating and training the workforce. And it would include the public infrastructure and all that. So it requires a proper framework, according to Minsky. Capitalist economy is a financial system, as I said before, and that's why every stage of capitalism has its own kind of financial system. Neoclassical economics is not useful because it denies the financial system matters. So Modigliani-Miller theorem says it doesn't matter how you finance. Whether you use retained earnings or you go into debt makes no difference. The financial structure has become more fragile. This makes it likely that stagnation or even a deep depression is possible. This idea of stagnation, I told you, was very common in the early 90s when Minsky first came to the Levy Institute, that we had entered a period of secular stagnation. The talk sort of disappeared because of the relatively good experience in the second term of Clinton, but that was all driven by bubbles, as we found out when it all collapsed. And Larry Summers and Paul Krugman revived secular stagnation after the recovery from the global financial crisis. I co-edited a book on secular stagnation. We have a lot of great contributions if you want to read about it with Flavia Dantas. So it has been an issue again. Minsky was worried that was likely and a deep depression is possible. So he had changed his mind. It could be possible. A stagnant capitalist economy will not promote capital development. You need a growing economy to get capitalists to want to invest. There's no reason to expand your capacity if you're stagnant. So you need a robust growing economy to get the capital development. However, this can be avoided by apt reform of the financial structure in conjunction with apt use of the fiscal powers of the government. So reform finance, and we need to get the government to use its fiscal powers to promote capital development rather than what it's spending on now, like interest, already talked about, and welfare. Instead, we need to develop. So how does MMT help? It provides a revised view of government finance. Affordability is not an issue. We talked enough about that. Revised view of central banking. The interest rate is a policy decision. The bond vigilantes play no role in that. So you don't need to worry that the government's going to try to sell bonds and the vigilantes go on strike and the government won't be able to borrow, because governments don't really borrow. They do sell bonds, but it's not a borrowing operation. Revised view of money and finance. All spending is financed at the time it occurs. It won't occur unless it's been financed, whether that's the private sector or the government. Society cannot run out of finance. It's not a scarce resource, just a system of credits and debits, just like scorekeeping at the baseball game. Affordability is not the question. The impacts on environmental, social, and financial stability are the concerns. So if you have the resources, if you have the technology, the only thing that matters is political will, because affordability is not a problem. Okay, making capitalism work. Neoliberalism is dead, as dead as laissez-faire was in 1929. Free markets aren't free, they never were free. And they don't equilibrate, they never did. Finance is an intermediate good. I think it was Jamie Galbraith one time who said, finance is like the tire on the car. It would be pretty bizarre if the tire manufacturer got most of the profits from the car. Okay, finance is like the tire, but finance does get most of the profits from producing cars. It's far more profitable than the actual production process. It gets an increasing share. You can plot the financial sector's share of profits growing tremendously over the past 40 years. So anyway, it's an intermediate product that's vastly overpaid, and it's frequently a dangerous product. In the case of private equity, what happens to the firms? They usually get destroyed. Okay, private equity walks away with money, but they strip the firms, and the firms eventually go bankrupt. Toys R Us was an example in the United States that just completely disappeared. And so it needs to be downsized, should not be permitted to own enterprises. This is a big problem, letting finance start owning productive enterprises. So if they're just supplying finance, but they can't make the decisions for the firms, then at least there's some chance the firm is going to make decisions, as what my colleague Fred Lee always said was, seeing the firm as a going enterprise. In other words, you want to survive. Okay, it's in their interest to survive. May not be in the interest of the financial firm that owns the firm for the firm to survive. Okay, they want to make quick money, and death of the firm might be a good thing. So anyway, you don't want to allow this. Plus they're not going to make good decisions about finance if they own the firms. That's why we didn't allow it in the United States. But now it's common for private equity to come in and buy firms and control them. get a big enough share of stocks so they can dictate what the policies will be. We shouldn't allow that. Wall Street, the Wall Street Silicon Valley nexus now controls the economy, the government, the political parties, the media, thought, and speech. At least in the United States, this is absolutely true. Okay, Musk is sitting there, okay, as president. Okay, Trump sits off to the side, and Musk speaks for him and makes his decisions for him. Okay, so Silicon Valley controls the whole thing, and they were by far the biggest funders of the campaign. We need to restore a clear separation between finance and ownership of productive enterprise. Necessities of life should not be controlled by for-profit capitalist enterprise. Okay, never should have been. But now we're in a position where we need to take it out of their hands. Food, shelter, medical care, education, retirement, and recreation should be taken away from the capitalist part of the economy. It should not be production for profit at all. Now, some of these are not in some countries. Okay, a lot of European countries, the healthcare system is taken away. Okay, in the United States, what Obama did was he put the for-profit sector in more control. Education, parts of our educational system are taken away from the capitalists. Parts are controlled by the capitalists. And it's likely we're going to move more in that direction with the current president. Now, for the long term, I don't know how successful that will be. Retirement in some countries is not controlled by the private sector. In the United States, we've always had a mixture, and the private sector wants to get control of Social Security. And I know Trump would love to do it. Virtually every Republican president has wanted to do it. Bush Jr. said he would do it. The seniors have prevented them from being able to do it. But there definitely is a desire to do that. So retirement should be taken away. Recreation, we have a mixture. Yeah, I'm not saying all recreation should be taken away, but the public sector should supply sufficient recreation for everyone to be able to enjoy without paying individually to a for-profit company. Okay, maybe food and shelter is more controversial, but in some countries, public housing is normal, supplied by the government. And I think that we can still have some role for rich people to have developers build their houses for them and they can pay for them perfectly fine. But we should have public housing for anyone who wants or needs it. And finally, same thing with food. If you want to go to fancy restaurants, fine. But everyone should be guaranteed a sufficient supply of food that is taken out of the for-profit capitalist enterprises. Modern capitalist economies require big government and big bank. This was Minsky's argument. A big bank is the central bank, not big banks. It's the central bank, small banks with a central bank to contain capitalism's natural faults. Okay, the first two are Keynes, unemployment, excessive inequality. What Minsky did was add the third one, instability. Minsky argued it's there, but it's hidden. Okay, so what he did was bring it out. That's the third fundamental fault of capitalism. And he always argued that he's interpreting Keynes and standing on his shoulder, not necessarily repeating what Keynes actually said. Okay, that was it. We got time for questions.
Finally, it's a political problem, no? Because the financial sector serves itself. They invest in the same sector, no? Finance has retreated from the productive sector. And the problem is that the financial sector is the hegemonic sector. No? And nonetheless, that they have occasionated the financial crisis, they maintain the same economic policy. There are enough political power for the productive sector, for workers, unemployment, political parties, in order to control the financial sector in favor of the full employment or productive sector. And the problem is that, yes, the crisis of 2008 and 9 was deeper than the crisis of the 1929 and 33. And yes, they maintain the same economic policy in favor of the financial sector. You know? All the governments acts when they generated crisis, the governments and the central bank acts in favor of them. You know? Not in favor of the productive sector, not in favor of the unemployment. When, yes, I have said that only in a deeper crisis, when people are on the streets, is when this situation is going to change. I don't know, what do you think about it?
Well, in a way, the 29 crash was deeper. It affected everybody. So half of the banks failed. They had depositors. There's no deposit insurance. Average people were hurt. The financial part of the global financial crisis in the United States, I don't remember how many banks we had, but probably approximately 6,000. There probably were only 8 affected. Average depositors, average people wouldn't have been touched at all by shutting down those 8. It would have affected rich people, would have affected financial markets, wouldn't have affected people. So there was a difference between the two. And it's because we had FDIC, but also it was because of what those banks did that the other 5,992 did not do. They didn't engage in any of that crazy stuff. So they would have been fine. So it was just a lie that the Treasury, Paulson, he was the Secretary of the Treasury, he goes to Congress on Friday and says, there will be no financial system on Monday if you don't give me $800 billion. And that was a lie. The financial system would have been fine. Those banks would have been in trouble. And by the way, Congress told him no. Okay, no financial system. He came back and he changed what he was going to do with the money, and then they gave it to him. But then he realized by Monday, 800 billion would do nothing. And that's why the Fed had to take over. He went to Bernanke and said, we got all the money we're going to get out of the Congress. Your job now. Okay, Treasury couldn't do it. So that's why the Fed spent 29 trillion because it's independent. Nobody wants to interfere in what they do. Okay, anyway, yes, it's true. The time that you can reform the financial system is when you crash. When you aren't crashing, it's extremely difficult to do it. So politically, it's a huge problem that we didn't take the opportunity last time to do it. Maybe part of the problem is that the crisis, the crash, just affected these elite banks. So people weren't sufficiently upset. In the 30s, they were. Okay, they're starving. That didn't happen this time. So maybe even a financial crisis alone is not going to be enough because it doesn't affect regular people. But that is the time to do it. And that's exactly what Roosevelt did and what Obama did not do. Never really supported much change in the financial system. So yeah, it's political, but I don't think that that makes any difference to what economists ought to do, which is study the economy, see what's wrong with it, and propose solutions. And whether or not the politics are right for the time, I think that's what we have to do so that it's there. If the time becomes right, it will be there so that people who want to change things can understand what was wrong and what do you need to do. But the politics are really difficult. I guess people are asking about expectations with Trump. Things are going to get bad. And we are due for a financial crisis, whether a Democrat had won or not. We're due for one because the debt ratios have gone up a lot. Private sector debt ratios, household debt ratios. And so just looking at the debt, the leverage, it can happen. As long as you're growing, it makes it easier. As growth slows, if people are cutting back, and it looks like they are. The latest data looks like average Americans are using their credit cards less. They had been using credit cards to consume, and that's why things were pretty strong. So if they slow that down, then without growth, things get a lot harder to support all the debt that's been created. So financial crisis is probably due. I wouldn't expect the Trump administration to do a very good job of responding. Just looking at the people he's appointed, they are, if you want to be mean, you could say they're incompetent, but they're at least not very skilled for the positions they've got. You take a Fox News host and put him in charge of some agency, he's not going to do a very good job. That's what George Jr. did. He took a guy who worked in horse performance or something and put him in charge of FEMA, and then hurricane hit New Orleans. And that's why the response was a disaster. This guy knew a little bit about horse breeding. And those are the kind of people that Trump is appointing. So the response won't be good. So I guess the positive outlook is things are going to be bad. And then there could be some movement for change. But, economists can do their job, but you're right. It's going to depend on politics. We wouldn't have gotten the New Deal without a depression. Okay, we had a free market ideology, laissez-faire presidents. And Roosevelt probably would have had no chance of winning, but we crashed. And then he won. And he's rewarded 4 times. Okay.
Hola, hola. Well, my question, Professor, is about the conversation, well, the presentation that we had yesterday. So I was thinking about when you talk about Minsky idea between that difference to the banks to approach to the central bank through the discount window, or to do that through the open market operations. So when you said that all of the debt of the government, they're circulating in the economy, is practically our wealth. My question is, do you think that this kind of open market operations means that this kind of wealth of the government is just trapped in the financial system? And my question is because I'm interested in understand how the government prefers, particularly after the reforms, the structural reforms in Mexico in 1994, to financing not the government spending, but the financial sector, with having in mind the believing that the private sector would be better, financing all the activities and the production. So, but what we saw is that all the liquidity that was in a certain kind of thing created, it was this trap in the financial system. So I know that some post-Keynesians don't believe that this kind of purchases, of government purchases by the central bank, makes profit for the financial industry. But my question, and I think that probably all those that it means QE and this kind of purchases by the central bank, actually they serve to, to settle the debts with other financial institutions that the banks have. So this is one of my questions. And because I'm interested as well to make a relation with the shadow banking. I think that this kind of institutions, so that they cannot receive deposits, they are looking to this kind of IOUs that are on the top of the pyramid that you said, to try to settle the debt relations. So that's it.
Okay. So when central banks and treasuries adopt procedures to allow the treasury to spend, and it's fairly common to have a rule against the central bank buying bonds directly from the treasury. And then it's also common, but not universal, to require the treasury to have a positive balance at the central bank before it can send a check out or electronic payment. So those are common. And so they develop procedures to make sure there's always a positive balance. And one of those is to sell bonds. The bonds then are in the United States, we have dealer banks that handle it. They must place bids. So they're always going to place bids. The Treasury will announce an auction. The Treasury will survey the banks to see what kind of bond they want. Do they want short-term, long-term? Recently, they haven't wanted long-term. And it would be kind of dumb to try to sell what they don't want. So typically, the Treasury will take into account what they said they wanted, and they're going to sell what they want. And that will, they will then purchase them and then place them into the market. Okay. When they go into the market, bank reserves are taken out. And the reserves have to be there already in the system. Those reserves are net financial wealth in the private sector because it's a debt of the Fed. When the bonds are sold, the bonds are the net financial wealth. Okay. They're the same price, because if you had to pay 100 for the bond is worth 100, you lost 100 of reserves. So dollar for dollar. The financial wealth remains the same, but now it's treasury debt. Okay, so all you did was change a central bank debt to a treasury debt. The financial wealth remains the same. The financial wealth is created by the treasury spending. So that's how the reserves get into the system. And taxes take it out. So if you spend but don't tax it out, or don't tax all of it out, that's what creates the wealth. It's the spending by the government that's greater than the taxes. That gets accumulated in the private sector as wealth. And it's going to be a combination of At any point in time, you can measure it. A combination of cash, which is the treasuries, coins are the treasury's liability, paper money is the central bank's, reserves, central bank liability, bonds, treasury liability. Okay, so that composition can change if you engage in QE, but you're not changing the wealth. Okay, you can change the composition. With QE, the idea was we're only trying to get the bonds that are held by banks out of the system and put reserves in. So we're going to change what the bank is holding from bonds to reserves. For banks, the only difference is the interest earning, because functionally they're equal, especially if it's bills. The bills rate is the same as the Fed funds rate, which means banks view them as absolutely identical assets to hold. If it's a 10-year, then the difference is largely depending on what you think the central bank is going to do to interest rates. So for a while, 6 months ago, the markets thought the Fed would keep lowering rates, which helps the long-term end, but now they don't believe it. That's why the market doesn't want long-term, because now they don't believe the Fed is going to lower rates anymore. So anyway, you got those decisions going on. But the idea was not to take bonds out of the hands of the public. It was to take bonds out of bank balance sheets. So it really would have no impact. And if the government did buy bonds from the public, then yes, the public would be getting a bank liability, not the Fed's liability, a private bank's liability instead of a government bond, and maybe they would view them differently. But that wasn't the purpose of QE. Okay. Does the QE increase bank profits? No, it doesn't, because the value of these two things are the same, dollar for dollar, and the bonds probably earn more than the interest the Fed pays on reserves. Okay, interest on reserves is the lowest interest rate in the US. So if the open market operation, QE, is taking bonds out of banks, you're making them less profitable, not more profitable, because now they're going to hold something that earns, say, 1% instead of 2%. So we argued against QE, saying, this is kind of crazy. We've got financial problems, and you're going to reduce the profitability of banks to try to get them to lend more. Didn't make a whole lot of sense. And it didn't work. It didn't work anywhere. It didn't stimulate any economies, because at best, banks' profits from holding government debt was lower, because they were holding reserves. Now, if the Fed buys bonds that have fallen in value because interest rates have gone up, so a capital loss, now you're benefiting the banks. That's what the Fed did after Silicon Valley failed. So that did increase their profits. They were assuming they didn't want to hold the bonds to maturity. Those bonds were worth a lot less than what they expected them to be worth. And the Fed said, we will buy them at the original value. So yes, that was generating profits for the system. The Fed didn't make that clear to voters or the politicians that what we're doing is we're going to take the losses, okay, and help them to avoid losses because they're in trouble. The bonds don't really get trapped in the banks. The financial institutions, pension funds, and so on, they're dealing with the dealer banks. They put in their orders. The dealer banks have bought a bunch of them, and they're trying to place them in the markets. So if quantitative easing got big enough, then you probably would hear complaints from the financial sector telling the Fed that they want bonds and they can't buy them. I don't know that that ever happened during QE. It did happen during the Clinton surplus. The financial markets started complaining to the Fed. The surplus means they're not placing bonds. What they're doing is retiring them. And we're short of bonds. So pension funds and insurance companies needed bonds. And the Fed started holding conferences around the country, counseling them on what they're going to do in this new environment in which we're going to retire all the bonds. Because Clinton said 15 years of surpluses. And the financial markets were panicking about this. We need government bonds. And so the Fed went around and said, well, you guys can buy mortgage-backed securities, which they did. Okay. And then got them all in trouble. But so yes, if the central bank bought too many, there will be financial market participants who are going to complain. And most likely the Fed's going to stop doing it, because why would you take bonds away that the financial markets need? So I think that they're usually going to be smart enough to figure that out.
Thank you so much, Professor Roy, for your lecture. I have a question, because it was not that clear to me. How come neoclassical economics deny the usefulness of the financial system, given that they advocate of the efficiency on stock market to fund investment? Yes, the investment's productive or the other type. Thank you.
Well, I don't think they're arguing that it's useful. I think they have an incorrect view of the way that it works. Okay, so they think that financial institutions take in savings and then they lend them out. It used to be they also believed the deposit multiplier story. The central bank controls the money supply by controlling reserves in a fractional reserve system. You still hear that from financial markets people. I don't know why the truth has not gotten through to them. Pretty much the only people I ever hear who still think that banks need reserves to make loans are working in financial markets. I'm not sure why that is. But anyway, they still believe loanable funds. So savers are the source of the funds that financial markets then distribute. It's not that they see that as not useful. The argument is that it's efficient, and that it doesn't matter whether a firm sells stock, retains earnings, or borrows. Those are all supposed to be equivalent operations, which would be true given the assumptions that they have to make to prove it's true. Okay, the conclusion is contained in the assumptions. So you assume a world with perfect knowledge, no uncertainty, so that you can evaluate the risks of everything. Then, as Charles Goodhart argues, actually, in that world, there would be no banks, because what banks do is specialize in assessing risks. But in that kind of world, you probably wouldn't even need it. But their argument is it doesn't matter which one you choose. Okay, so there's nothing special about banks opposed to the stock market or retaining your own earnings. I don't know if I have anything else to say. It's just they start with assumptions that a Keynesian would say are not representative of the real world. And, sometimes that doesn't matter, but on this, it's critical. Okay. So sometimes you can assume things that just simplify the argument, and that's what they claim they're doing. But in this case, it leads to entirely the wrong answer, because it's uncertainty is an essential characteristic, is what Keynesians would say.
Randy, this big bank and big government, I suppose that the big bank is the central bank, and it used the rooster, no, in the financial market to improve the development. But when you talk about big government, specific, what is the idea of Minsky when they talk big bank and big government? Because when I'm analyzing the Chinese economy, one of the keys, theoretic keys to understand how China has grown very fast, and they have a lot of investment around the world and whatever, very different from USA from the last 50 years. For me, it's very important, this big bank and big government. And I think though these two concepts can explain that China is very different from the ones of USA. I don't know what I am in the wrong, I don't know.
Well, so the simplest way to approach it is that Minsky wants the Treasury's balance sheet to help stabilize the economy. So this is also the functional finance view. The budgetary outcome is to balance the economy, not to balance the budget. So that's Minsky's view too. Why does it have to be a big government? Because the economy is big. And to stabilize a big economy that has big swings, you need a government whose budget is big enough to have big swings. So as a rule of thumb, Minsky used to say it needs to be as big as investment. So if investment is 20% of the economy, you need the government to be 20% of the economy so that its swing can be as big as the investment swing. If you have other injections and leakages, like your current account, you might need the government to be bigger than investment, because it also has to take account of the swings of net exports. If you're a net importer like the US, that's a big leakage out. So the government's got to cover that leakage too. So if you had a 3% economy, how is the budget deficit going to be big enough to cover swings of investment and now net exports when you have open economies? Can't be big enough. Okay, the deficit would have to be, 200% of government spending or something, not 10% of spending. So that's the answer, just in terms of relative size, to get a rule of thumb. But then you list what you need the government to do in a modern capitalist economy. The US federal government until 1929 was 3% of the economy. It would be bigger when we had big wars, but otherwise it would go back to be very small, which was sort of like the size of the governments of kings in the medieval period. Their government was very small, except in war. And then it would increase tremendously. And they would run up huge debts. I said before, I think 200% of GDP was common for crowns of Europe because of the big wars. Other than that, the government didn't do very much. And that's okay if you're not a modern capitalist economy. But a modern capitalist economy needs the government to do lots of things in order to compete with other countries. So that's why modern economies need a big government, because government has to do things, not just balance the swings, but the government has to supply, organize, innovate, research, do all those things that the private sector won't do or can't afford to do because they're for profit. Government doesn't have to be for profit. So we need the government to do lots of things. And if you look at capitalist economies, they run the range of, say, 25% of the economy to 50% of the economy. US, Japan, 25, France, 50. I'm not sure what China is. China's going to be big too. And within that range, you could credibly argue that it's okay. Right? I think the US is too small, but we also have state and local government. For us, that's a pretty big part of the economy. They're about 60% of the size of the federal government. So they're fairly important. Of course, they can't run deficits. So that's a problem. But if you look at Mexico, the last I heard, which is a long time ago, is 13%. What does that tell you? You're not in the range that we find of the developed capitalist countries that are doing okay. Your government is probably far too small. It's probably half the size of the minimum to have a country, a capitalist country, that's going to operate well.
Yes, and the other question that, well, it's also common because when you talk about Silicon Valley, well, it was Silicon Valley, and then it was the First Republic Bank, and then Signature Bank, and at the same time, few minutes, after a few minutes, you have the Credit Suisse and the USD. And it was very interesting. Janet Yellen immediately rescued Silicon Valley and all that. But they didn't make the same thing when they had the Lehman Brothers. Why? They get in panic, or because Lehman Brothers was very different of what happened? Because if you say that behind Silicon Valley was Musk and all this technological, so I don't understand. It was a political decision to rescue immediately because they are the technological, because they didn't do it with Lehman Brothers and they just make a mess.
Yeah. I think that the Fed believes it made a mistake with Lehman. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to repeat that. Why did they allow it? I think Lehman was really hated. And they wanted it to fail. And I think everybody in the market wanted it to fail. And but I think they still thought it was a mistake, because then things snowball really quickly. And so they're probably not going to do it. Is Silicon Valley? Yes. It was partly because the deposits were Silicon Valley, and that's supposed to be our innovative part, and we can't lose them and all that. It's also because there is this problem of uninsured deposits, which was not just Silicon Valley. Banks rely on uninsured deposits. People will take, not people, institutions will take the risk because it's more convenient. So if you're not for profit of any size, you're going to have a big deposit account, and you're going to exceed the $250,000 limit. And so they typically will hold uninsured deposits. So there are institutions all across America. It's not just Silicon Valley, firms and not-for-profits that have accounts that are bigger than the insured limit. And if you allow them to fail, then it's going to be hard for banks to attract that. And it calls into question the whole thing. And there could be runs across the country on uninsured deposits. So they didn't want it to spread. And so temporarily they guaranteed everything. And many people argue, I think somewhat convincingly, that we should just insure all deposits no matter how big. The reason we didn't do it originally is because Congress felt that that's, catering to the rich, giving them this benefit, and they can afford to take risks, so let them take risks. But on the other hand, banks are, they're chartered, so they're quasi public, and you can't have runs on banks. So the end result could be that Congress changes its view and says, yeah, let's just, if it's a bank and it has a charter, its deposits are insured, period. Oh, well, we still have time. If there's one more question, we got time.
If you can just make a further comment on your view on inflation, because earlier when you were talking about the value of money, you made some side comment about how economies are used to just see the value of money of the inversion of the price level. And how do you relate this idea of inflation with what you presented about the value of money? Because for me, it leads to the Marxist transformation problem, from value to prices. So just wanted to pick your brain a little bit.
Well, at the aggregate level, that is going to determine the value of money. The total production divided by the labor hours, you got the value of money in terms of, the wage unit, you've got the value of money. The problem with inflation is there is no unique way to measure it. So we've got indices, and some are probably better. The ones that we use are not based on market prices. So they're not the prices people pay. The general trend of prices is up because when firms have pricing power, they're generally going to take it unless they think they're going to get punished. But when times are pretty good, they can get away with gradually raising their prices and the consumers don't punish them. Okay. And so the general trend in good times is going to be up. What used to happen before World War II is prices also went down. So in bad times, firms would have to cut their price trying to sell output, and the prices actually would go down. So you could get fairly stable prices for 100 years, which 19th century, the price level as calculated was the same. And people say, see, the gold standard worked. But the prices were up and down. Every time you had a depression, you had deflation. And then every time you had recovery, you got some inflation. And so they equalized one another. The problem with deflation is that it leads to a depression. Growth is not good. So that was the problem. You would add good periods and bad periods. On average, the growth was not great. Even for the United States, the book by Gordon, the special century, which was 1870 to 1970. That was our special century, our best economic performance. But the first half of that was slow growth. But it was good because we were building the capacity. The second half, it's high growth. And the reason it's high growth is because we don't have depressions in the second half. So we decided we'd rather not have deflation. We'd rather not have depressions. And so the general trend has to be up. And as long as it's not, as I said before, economists can't find any bad effects except for political. But as long as it's not too high, and too high is defined by your country. In the United States, Americans can probably accept 3%. The problem was we got used to 0. And that had nothing to do with America. It was China, India a little bit less, other Asian countries that gave us 0 inflation. And so we got used to unusually low inflation. And so the combination of the COVID complete shutdown of the economy, then job losses and inflation, that's what caused the huge political problems. So it's an aberration, both the very low and then the actually not all that high, except for a few months, that has turned people so much against inflation. But I think, why does it tend to go up? And that's because the firms are taking advantage of pricing ability, and so they raise their price, and then the workers try to catch up, and then firms try again to raise the price to get more profits, and workers catch up. So I don't think it's inconsistent with the value theory. If you get prices going up, but the wages aren't going up, you start getting problems, which is you're not going to grow. And that's because firms are having trouble selling stuff. So that you need a source of demand that's not coming from the workers, is what I'm saying. If you can be an exporter, you can maintain that, but the US is not. Net exporters face more inflation than importers. Okay.
Bueno, pues les agradecemos a todas por acompañarnos, y especialmente la presencia del Dr. Ray, ¿no? Por este curso que es muy interesante. Avisos parroquiales. Tenemos el 21 de febrero la presentación del libro en el Palacio de Minería. Tenemos el seminario de Economía Fiscal y Financiera en 2 semanas, que sería el 24 al 26. Y el 5 de marzo, igual en Minería, tenemos la presentación de Ola Financiera, ¿no? Del número especial de Ola Financiera sobre agua, ¿no? Y aprovechamos la oportunidad para invitarlos a revisar Ola Financiera, donde pueden profundizar en muchas de estas discusiones que hemos tenido y donde, digamos, pueden encontrar más literatura al respecto. Bueno, pues muchas gracias y hasta luego.